Hi there, welcome to the Culture of Life podcast from Human Life International. I'm Tad Wojcik, the Mission Research Specialist, here with Father Shenan Boquet.
Tad, always good to be with you.
Yes, absolutely, Father. I'm back to that, I guess. Today we're talking about a Spirit and Life article you wrote recently, Father, about a pretty dark and honestly horrific subject, so we're going to try to avoid the details of that as much as we can, but if our listeners are interested more, we'll give a brief summary, but other than that, if our listeners are interested in more details, they can head over to hli.org/news and find the article entitled, the article about unborn children recovered recently in Washington, D.C. So maybe, Father, just a brief summary without too many of the gory details.
Yeah, Tad, what stirred the article, obviously, is the current story that I'm confident that our listenership is quite familiar with now, and that is the finding of 115 aborted children. And the story really revolves around the fact that, first of all, that these 115 human beings had been so easily, not only their life snuffed out by the crime and violence of abortion, but also they were being treated as waste. And this is how the story really unfolds. And again, like you said, there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of imagery in the sense of pictures and so forth. And I would just direct people, to my article to click on the links, and it'll help people understand the full story and the people involved. But what happened is that ultimately, three pro-life individuals, three women in this case, were at this particular abortion clinic to do vigil, to pray, to intercede, and they recognized that a waste company was picking up waste in the back of the building or somewhere near the building. And so when they inquired to the person, do you know what's inside these boxes? And the person really did not. Their answer was, no, I don't know. And they said, well, this is what's inside the boxes, and recognizing that they are human beings that are being discarded, aborted babies, and could we have them? And so this is how the story unfolds. And so what really stirred me, to write the story was not only just to let my own readership at HLI, know about the story. Sometimes people miss these headline stories, but also for us to talk about it, because when we look at the advocacy that really the story is about, it's about intervening for those that no one, for the ones who were voiceless, the ones that could not defend themselves from the violence of abortion, and in this situation, from another violence, and that is being discarded as rubbish, being treated as if they were thrown out a plastic bottle. And so this is really about an advocacy for life from its very beginning, protecting, defending human life so it doesn't meet this kind of tragedy. And number two is, and when we are faced with these situations, the call upon us, to advocate, for respectful treatment, of these human beings that have been, whose life has been taken from them. So that's what made me want to tell the story. And so again, like you said, just repeating, there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of important details in here, a lot of quotes. Actually, for those who are interested, there are pictures that were taken, and the story unpacks itself. So I hope people will move to the article. And of course, I'm not just telling news. I'm writing a little bit more in the details and the whole issue of the principles of respect and, the issue of abortion and the violence of abortion. But I also, in the column, by, talking about advocacy. So I think that's what we're going to talk about today, Tad.
Yeah, and just a warning for anyone who does want to further explore those details. It's very grim, very dark, very disturbing. I myself didn't look at those pictures, but I'm sure they're pretty graphic. And again, I didn't say this, but let me just note here that 100 of the children, you'll see images there, but you also will see the images of 5 children, who are very close, who are viability, which means they were beyond the 24 or 25 week period and beyond. So they were. You'll see images of that, and that's really what the story starts really unfolding. Is how these particular children met their end, not only in the abortion facility, but the question is how. There's the thought that, or the way it looks, that the children were born, and one particularly born alive, and how that child met its end. So there's a lot of uncertainty still, a lot of the story is still unfolding. The sad thing is, and this is what kind of always is upsetting, is not only the fact that we're dealing with the horrific end of human life and these violent acts of abortion, but also, how sadly our culture, state, our government continues to protect the abortion industry. And even when things like this are exposed, when it's brought to the surface, when it's unmasked, and to see how thus far we have seen the FBI, the government, the agencies that really should be asking questions, about these, particularly about the 5 children specifically, but they're not. Thus far, it's being ignored, it's being pushed aside. Now, granted, there are a lot of people still pushing back, but the main line, government line right now, nothing's wrong. We don't see any crime in this. Even the police chief made a comment recently. So the article kind of brings this out. It points you to those comments, and people who are interested can go and look a little deeper. There's a lot of writing right now on it, which is good because it exposes it. It brings it to the surface, and we should be appalled. On every level of this story, every level. Appalled by abortion itself, which I know we are, but to see, again, what this story is unmasked for us to see.
Yeah, the desecration of human life. They're not even allowed a proper burial, and we should mention the majority of those children were ultimately given a Catholic burial,
right.
But not those 5 late-term aborted children. So that's the kind of continuing tragedy here.
Right.
Oh, one of the main ones, at least. Anyway, moving from those details that people can find elsewhere, you mentioned that we should be appalled, right? And that's the natural response to this sort of thing. The Christian pro-life response, obviously, is being appalled. But where do we go from there, Father? That's the question we're going to focus on today.
Absolutely,
I think.
And it's a great conversation to have, and it's not one that our audience would be unfamiliar with, but it really is the call to advocacy. When we consider the people who intervened in this situation, so they were presented with an opportunity, and they recognized they could intervene and at least be able to provide, a proper burial, for the remains of these human beings. And so then the story unfolded in a different way than because of all the details. But the advocacy component, the fact that that this wonderful group of ladies and many, many others around our world are standing in solidarity with the unborn, and also standing in solidarity with these women who feel that there's no alternative. They think that there's no another path for them to take other than to end the life of their child. So there's so many ways that advocacy is unfolding itself. And this is what the story also helps, at least it did for me. I kept asking myself, and even as someone who is already involved in advocacy, who's working in a Catholic apostolate, who's been engaged in this conversation for a number of decades now, kind of telling my age, but I stepped back and I asked myself a question, what am I doing? Am I doing enough? And we have staff members here at HLI who have been with us, nearly 30 years. And I remember they started off, with the rescuing children and rescuing their mothers and standing in solidarity and being arrested, and they were willing to put themselves on the line to protect human life and to protect the mothers from this violent crime and to say that this is wrong. And so we have a lot of people who have been involved in this, but every time I come across this kind of story, which this one made the headlines, there are many that don't. This is happening daily around our country. Abortion mills who are discarding the remains of human beings as if they were rubbish. So this is happening right in front of us every day and in our neighborhoods. And sometimes people drive by these places and don't even realize what's happening there. So for myself, when I was writing the article and reflecting on the story, I kept saying, what am I doing? Am I doing enough? What more could what else should I be doing? Obviously I can write about it. I can tell the story. I can reach out to the audience of HLI. I can use this podcast as an opportunity. But is that enough? And I can write my senator. I can write my congresspeople. I can, write letters. I can do a lot. So, but is that enough?
So here, the question for each of us is, we have to ask that question. And I'm hoping that our conversation, brief as it will be today, is just going to do that. It's to make us ask. Not everybody's called to be like these ladies who did what they did, and in that moment they made a prudential decision how to intervene, and they moved forward. And there are many people who make those kinds of decisions, in front of abortion facilities, when they intervene, when they enter into a conversation, when they try to offer a word of counsel. That we know around our country you have so many different difficulties in different states because of state laws. You have safe zones, they call them, and you can't go beyond a certain point as a sidewalk counselor. You can't be on the road. You can't. There's so many different things that kind of are hindering. But yet people step over that line, and they make those decisions because of the situation in front of them. And I admire that tremendously. And I know a lot of people who have been arrested multiple times, stepping out in places of great difficulty, because this is how real this is.
Sometimes that's just literally stepping over a certain threshold.
Exactly. And so, but we
500
all have to
feet
ask,
or whatever from the door. Or something.
Exactly. And I mean, even not just in our own country. We, HLI being a global, apostolic work. We deal with different laws around the world, and I can tell you in Australia and New Zealand, we think here in our states that the abortion industry has been successful in kind of hindering us. Step into other countries and you'll see how even more difficult it can be for our pro-life advocates. But and I know just recently a law in New Zealand was passed, again, tightening that restriction of our advocacy. So again, it's always before us. What can we be doing? And today I brought with me a little show and tell, so to speak, is a wonderful document that I know that our audience is going to be very familiar with, and that is the Gospel of Life, Evangelium Vitae. And if you're not familiar with it, here's a chance. Okay, I'm introducing it to you. It's the landmark encyclical by John Paul II. And I'm going to focus primarily, Tad, on the latter part. And that is what I love about the great works of John Paul, whether it was an apostolic exhortation, like Familiaris Consortio, or with this encyclical, the Holy Father, most of the time, ended with a call to action. A pastoral plan, something calling us, to be engaged. And in paragraph 95, so I'm really toward the end, there's 10 more paragraphs. And so in there, the Holy Father is challenging. I'm going to speak to myself now. He's challenging me, the reader of this encyclical, that, what am I doing? What am I going to be engaged in? What should I be doing? And he starts off by quoting St. Paul. We are the light of the world. And so, obviously quoting Jesus, and so who's speaking that you are the light of the world, you are the salt of the earth, so what does that mean? And the Holy Father is reminding us we're being sent, we're being called. And he actually, before he moves to a prayer and reflection of Our Lady at the very end, he actually ends by telling us that this gospel of life is entrusted to every one of us. And so whether we be Christian or not Christian, this message of life is for every one of us. So the Holy Father makes it clear that there are no people to sit on the sidelines. And what I mean by sidelines, when people become indifferent to this, and I think that's the first challenge of advocacy, is the whole understanding of the principle of solidarity, and the fact that that I am my brother's keeper. And this is what starts this conversation, the Good Samaritan here. And so to recognize that every woman who thinks that this is the only way to resolve her dilemma, that means I need to step forward. And if I could, Tad, I'd like to go back and talk about another subject, just very briefly, the heartbeat law in Texas. And I've written on this a number of times, and we've talked about this in our podcast. But one of my most recent articles, I complimented the state of Texas because not only is it standing in solidarity through its law protecting human life. Of course, I would love to see it 100%, and we're going to get there. But what they also did is they implemented or put together over $100 million of funding to support those who are working with women in these situations, to give them a path that is completely different, and to support them in their effort to keep their child or to help them to move forward. That to me is a tremendous, it's the only state I know of that's done that. And I would really challenge, and anyone who's listening who happens to work in state government, please, this is an advocacy. I mean, this is a state
advocating for life, not only through its law, but in practice, and saying, here, we're putting in $100 million is not chump change here. Mm-hmm. That's a substantial amount of money that can be used for good, to support women in need, to support their children, and to protect families. That, to me, is tremendous. And John Paul calls upon the state in Evangelium Vitae. He challenges the state to realize its responsibility and duty to protect human life. And the state of Texas, through that law, is doing that. And through this, I won't call it a policy, I'm not sure how they wrote this into their law, but the $100 million being allocated toward this. But I would love to see that duplicated. So with that said, I got to return back to me now. So in this moment, when John Paul is talking about, is for all of us who are listening, it's really to ask, how am I engaged in this conversation? And, for HLI, our staff, we've talked about this, of recent, sometimes, with people, they can't physically be engaged. They don't have the ability to interact in ways that we do here at HLI. But through their financial contribution, through their prayer, through their support, they are advocating for life. They're advancing a mission that's advocating for life. That's a way to do that. And many people do this in their dioceses, in their states, supporting their state pro-life organizations, supporting, whether it be 40 Days for Life or many other organizations, that are their local pregnancy care centers. This is an advocacy. That's a phenomenal way to do it. And then you have those, like the ladies we talk about in the very beginning of the column, who take it up, if I want to call it a notch, if you will, pick it up in the sense of moving now where people are out in front of these abortion facilities, intervening. The Sidewalk Counselors, who are not just there in prayer vigil, they're there to intervene. They're there to engage in the conversation. And that steps up that now. And that's not made for everyone, but for me, I can't excuse myself. That's the first thing I would say. Well, that's not for me. Well, I might be right. Maybe it's not my gift. But I don't know unless I really ask myself that question and begin to talk about it with myself, with God in prayer, but also hopefully I have a spiritual director, because that's where I should be holding these kinds of conversations. And in the words of Mother Teresa, that I often think about in Cardinal Sarah's book, The Power of Silence, he has a beautiful story about a fellow cardinal who was a young priest and who met Mother Angelica very early in his priestly life, had a great devotion, love of Mother Teresa. And long story short is he was asking Mother, what more could he do? And he went through the litany of saying, I do this, and he went through a litany of things, and Mother pulled her chair up really close to him and said, it's never enough. Never enough. And I've never forgotten those words, and I think that's so true for me. And that's how when I wrote this is what I was thinking. Ultimately, it's never enough. That these 115 children should never have been in that situation. The 115 mothers who made that should never have been in that situation. And those three ladies who were there in that moment, including the person working for the waste manager, should never have been in that situation, because we shouldn't be there. And why are we there? So we've not done enough, and that's why it can never be enough. Each of us on every level. And that's why John Paul begins paragraph 95 talking about this. And the whole encyclical, obviously, is about the principles and protection of human life. But as we navigate toward the end, John Paul, as he beautifully does, he's thinking the same way that each of us who are pastors, okay, here's the message, here are the principles, here are the teachings. Now, what do we do with it? And that's what John Paul did. He moved the conversation and said, okay, here's all the teaching. This is what's happening. This is what the difference between culture of life and culture of death. This is why the culture of death is advancing. Then he gets to toward the very end, and he says, okay, now we're being sent. Jesus is sending us out. We're called to evangelize. We are called to go out. And we need to really ask ourselves, how can we do that? And I would say that each and every person listening right now, and that in reading the article, I hope that will make them pause and do the same thing. And I can tell you, I'm still in prayer asking, what more should I be doing? What more can I do? And many times, Tad, people will say, well, what can you give me examples? Can you give me some ideas of what I could be doing, or what would be a positive way to make a difference? And what I would say there is, again, you have to know your own skills, your own abilities, your own limitations.
And with that, there are many great people that have skills that could be doing far more in this. Let me give you an example. When I think about people who are lobbyists for the pro-life movement, these are very skilled individuals, very knowledgeable, very articulate, very strong in the sense of being able to engage in conversation and to engage people in very, very important positions and to advance a cause, advance a mission, advance an agenda that is not in the narrative of our country. Now, there are people that have that skill set and need to have those skills in order to do that. We have people working in pro-life advocacy through law, actual lawyers and clerks that are helping people to advance this. There's so many different ways. I've worked with legislators, people sitting in our state houses and even on the national level that are again, they're not just engaged in their state. They go back into their communities. They go back into their own, if they're Catholic, in their own parishes. They're involved. I worked very closely with a state congresswoman, for a number of years, advancing the pro-life message. And so everyone's just got to keep asking. And I know, Tad, when people are going to read this, and because I think you and I talked about this, before coming in today for our podcast, are we called to do exactly what these ladies did? Maybe. That's because, again, we just need to ask ourselves, what am I doing? And with that, I think of Jorge Serrano. Just for some reason, he just comes to my mind. He's we've worked with Jorge since the early 1970s, when Jorge Serrano and Magdalena, his wife, met Father Paul Marks, our founder, in the early 70s. And he left a meeting, I think it was in Houston, if I remember the story completely, and he said to his wife, "What are we doing?" They were already active. They were already, he's an attorney. He went back in those early days, went back to school to get, training in theology and in the church's teaching, and actually eventually got a master's in bioethics, to help him to advance this cause. Because of him asking that question, there are now nearly over 160 pregnancy care centers throughout Latin America serving women, their children, and families, because Jorge and Magdalena asked a question. And that's really what I'm after here. And now, are all of our listeners, are they saying, okay, do I got to start a pregnancy care center? No, but maybe. There's so many things that we can be doing. And then the challenge really is to look at the situations and, like the ladies that we talk about in the column, they made a prudent decision in that moment, or I should say a prudential decision, I should say, to intervene in the way they did. And I think that's the real challenge. I mean, I've been with people at abortion facilities where I've watched counsels intercede in a way that the case demanded, but they would never have done that in a different kind of situation. So it takes wisdom, it takes a lot of prayer, it takes a lot of openness to the movements of the Spirit of God that pushes us and guides us and molds us, and to help us to do things we never thought we would do. And I think that's the real challenge what John Paul was after here. And so he even talks about educators, teachers. So in our Catholic system, do we talk about this? What you and I are doing today, many other podcasters are doing, and many good Catholics involved in the pro-life movement are very engaged in this. But how many people have never heard what we're talking about? How many people, good Catholics, have never even heard of Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life? How many people have never even opened its pages? The same way, Tad, when you and I talked about Humanae Vitae, on human life, one of the shortest, beautiful encyclicals, and people complain about it but never read it. And so how can you be against something when you don't know what it says? And so here, in parishes, this is something I integrated into pastoral ministry, in catechesis, but also in the outreach in the parish. Because John Paul's not just talking about the issue of abortion. He is addressing issues of euthanasia. He's addressing any and all issues that affect the dignity of human life. Anything that disrespects human persons, he's addressing here. So I say that because I don't want people to walk away, well, it's just about abortion. It's not. He's looking at the preeminent issue, right? And it is, but he's stretching it to look at all of it. And so that goes back now to what I said earlier. What am I doing? And so we can be talking about, working with people in hospice care,
Another issue today that's really in the scope of the culture of death, because sadly many people are being treated from a utilitarian point of view. That's a place where people can bring their skill, bring their gifts to intervene on behalf of our elderly, our sick, our dying. So what about advocating, for those who cannot advocate, like children with Down syndrome? When you look in Great Britain and you look in the Netherlands, and you look at many other parts of the world where a child that's diagnosed in the womb with Downs is often put to death, never sees the light of day, And so how are we advocating, for those who have no voice? There's so many ways, Tad, that this conversation can be discussed. And my intention in the article, our intention in our podcast, really is just that, is to prick the conscience of everyone who's listening, reading, and make them hopefully do what I'm doing. What am I doing? What more can I be? What else can I do? So that's kind of where I am with the column. It's what stirred me. The story stirred me. It made me angry, actually, and it upset me, to once again have this horror, be visible again, and it needs to be visible. It needs to be seen for what it is, and for that I'm grateful, that it's been exposed. But still, it just upsets me so much that that every time I hear of an abortion, it always makes me think, what more could we have done? What more should we have done? Could we have done more? To give this person an option, something different. And that's where I go back to Texas. I think that's an example. It's not a perfect setup yet. But the idea here, we have to keep doing this. I remember in another advocacy, this is out of Houston, Texas. It's kind of interesting. It's St. Michael's down in Houston near the Galleria. And I will never forget this. I had started going to Houston when I was a young boy. My dad worked in the oil industry and as a riverboat captain, pushing all these barges up and down the Mississippi and major rivers. And I remember going to Houston and seeing St. Michael's, and it was a huge sign. It's still there. It's a different sign now, but it's still there. The message is still there. And basically it says this. And it's sponsored by the parish, but it's really sponsored by the Knights of Columbus. And it says, any woman who finds herself in a difficult situation, we're here. So basically that parish has said, we are here for you. We will help you. That abortion should not be the answer. We are here. And that sign's in front lawn, dead center in the heart of Houston, right inside the major district, right around the Galleria, one of the major gallerias and malls. People pass by it all the time. It's off of Westheimer Boulevard, major boulevard. And it to me, that always touched me. And it made me think, even as a young boy, a young teenager, and then going through, into adulthood, that is an example to me. That's a witness. And so I think that it's a positive story. And how many have been helped by that parish, by those individuals? And then if we multiply that around our country, around our world, we are making a difference, and we have made a powerful impact. But as long as there is one, we still have much to do. One is unacceptable. So that's what upset me with this, is that, we're not doing enough. We're never doing enough. And I don't mean that in a critical, way. I just mean simply for what it says, as a church, as a local parish, as a local diocese, people of God, people of faith, people of life, this should upset us. And it should say, what more should we be doing? And that to me is what I'm hoping the column will do. So that's a kind of so it's a call to arms, kind of what I'm doing, and not weaponry arms, a call to arms, call to faith, call to step forward.
Right, and maybe we can just, you made a little note at the end of that exhortation, Father. So we are called to action, prayer and work, prayer and action, right? Something contemplative and something
right.
material, right? Martha and Mary.
Right.
But as you mentioned, there can be a tendency among some people to kind of let the action go first, right?
Right.
And that's why you said not to arms, as in, it's kind of unfortunate that we have to even make that caution, but it is such an emotional and passionate issue that there have been responses that have not been good in the past with, fighting fire with fire,
right.
Two wrongs, it's not going to make a right.
No, exactly.
And so maybe we can talk a little bit on that front, Father, about how there are situations where we do have to do things that many people might consider drastic, that may even be illegal in some way, but are never immoral, right? They're never, if there's, I don't know, maybe we could just, not too long, but just kind of.
Well, let's talk about just, for example, like the Sidewalk Counselors. So, and I'm not going to name any state because I know a few state laws, but things change so quickly, so I don't want to name a state. But I know a few states that I'm aware of that have these bubble zones. So basically, they've created a zone where a sidewalk counselor, a pro-lifer, cannot be. And I know people personally who always cross that line. All right, and I know they have been arrested many times over. And I think that that's an example that individual has to make for themselves. So for me to say, well, everyone should be doing that, that would be wrong. All right, but that individual has to make that decision, for themselves. The law is the law. They say, well, you should not be beyond this so many feet or so many yards, and that's what the law says. But we're dealing with something that is unjust. The murder of an innocent child is an unjust law of our country. I'm hoping that'll be changed very soon. But it is an unjust law. And I have to recognize that there is something of great importance here, and that's the human life of that child and the life of that child's mother. And so in that moment, that individual makes that decision. Am I going to follow her to that point? And in many cases they do. That's where they stop. But there could be a given moment when something just moves them. And it could be that maybe she said something that said, wait, there's something there. So I need to keep going. And it's a difficult, moment. And I know people, who do this on a daily basis. And I know some of our own HLI affiliates. One in particular, that was with us for many years, still with us. He's no longer serving as our director. Because now he's doing a family practice and counseling, and which is beautiful. So he's still very much involved in life. But Johannes was arrested 12 times, in Vienna, standing outside of what I would consider one of the more vile abortion facilities now closed because of our advocates, because they stood their ground and witnessed to life. And so, but I can tell you many stories, Tad, of many of those people out there who were just, violated themselves as counselors. They were, incited by others. People come in trying to get them to step over the line, if you will, to react. There's video of one of our great friends there that's been captured, and that was they prodding him, poking him, just trying to provoke him, and he within reason, he accepted all of it. And I'm thinking to myself, and I remember seeing that video going, I was very upset, and I'm thinking, God, could I do that? Could I stand there and not say anything, and not respond the way they want? And eventually they just gave up. But that takes great courage, in a way that I had to ask myself, do I have that kind of courage? When I would want to maybe reach out and respond, but that's not the response. And so these are the things that have to be really a case by case, situation by situation, and you have to know your own gifts and your own ability, And so, but what you just said is very important: is two wrongs never make a right. Doing something that is immoral. For example, there were those at one time that believed that that we should take the life of an abortionist because we're saving many more people. Well, no, sorry, that's incorrect. And so we need to recognize that there are limits, there are boundaries, there are moral boundaries, and those boundaries are clear. And in our response, and if we read the Evangelium Vitae, John Paul talks about that. He actually makes it very clear what our boundaries are and what our principles are and what guides our principles and how we are to respond and even react, how we are to react to situations. Now, it's not a to-do book. Okay, so it doesn't, A happens, do B. No, it's setting principles down. And that's what I love about our church. Our church sets forth principles, and, the whole principle of the law of God, do not kill. So obviously, we recognize that there is a great crime that's being done in that building to that individual. So that's what brings us there. That's what places us in that moment. And so like, Johannes, sometimes, you have to maybe go that extra mile. And I have been in places myself where I stand in solidarity with others who are witnessing. And I've seen with my own eyes, people being arrested
because they stood in front of a door, or they lined up and formed a human chain with their arms, just trying to block entrance, and which was illegal. And so, but we stood there, and I happened to be further down the line, and not near toward the end. I wasn't the one arrested, but the first 5 were, because they were right in front of the doors. So the police didn't deal with anyone else. And when others tried to get back together and form it again, then that just created, a little more difficulty with the police and so forth. But those are examples that happen daily. And what I would say, to anyone who's already engaged, thank you. For those that are already active, thank you. For those that are thinking, what more can I be doing? What should I be doing? I would suggest, talk about it. Find a friend who shares the heart, mind, and soul. Talk to someone and say, what more can I be doing? How can I help? Maybe talk to a fellow pro-lifer that's already active. Talk to the spiritual director. But I would say that you have to know yourself, and I'm going to share this story, keep the names out. But this was a gentleman that was assisting in prayer vigil, and also eventually was moving toward doing a little counseling, sidewalk counseling, advocacy. And one day he it was too emotional, and it got the better of him, and he really recognized it. And unfortunately, he crossed the line, not in a good way. He allowed his emotions to get the better of him, and he had the mind enough to pull back. And so I happened to meet this person, and he asked me, he says, I want to be involved, but I'm getting so upset now these days, and I'm getting angry at what I'm seeing. And so my advice to him, well, it was time to pause. It was time to step back for a moment, regroup. And so, Tad, what you mentioned earlier, as you started this little part of this segment, is back to prayer. And my suggestion is that, one, it's time to go back to prayer. I mean, always praying. So, but for him, maybe that fell apart. I don't know. All I know is that little part that I was introduced to. But my recommendation is, it's time to pull back. Take time to be rejuvenated, refreshed. Talk to your spiritual director, talk to your confessor, talk to a fellow pro-life leader. But then I found out, I said, tell me, what do you do for a living? What's your profession? And he told me. I said, well, you ever thought about helping? In this case, he was a general contractor. And I said, you ever thought about maybe working with the pregnancy care centers for a while? They're always looking for renovation, for plumbing, electrical, improving their facilities to help our women and help, our children and families. And his response was, well, will that make a difference? And of course it makes a difference. And so he stepped out of the kind of front line for a moment and stepped into a not always seen place, but was able to support the life cause. And eventually, because I still talk to him once in a while, he's back. Doing both now. But he regrouped. He needed to refresh his spirit and to be able to not be caught up in that emotion, which can be very real. And as you said in the very beginning of our podcast, Tad, it can be a dark place. It can be a very difficult place, and it can be filled with a lot of emotion. And if we're not guided by the Spirit of God, if our prayer lives are not very strong and anchored, and we're not really being guided by that relationship with our Lord Jesus Christ, who is the one who sends us out on mission, it's his mission, this is his ministry. And if we forget that, and we focus only on ourselves, and we think about, this is my work, quote unquote, the danger begins to happen. And so we lose sight. And sometimes we just need to pull back and refocus. And so I guess one way what I would encourage is 2 things. This is what I used to do in parish ministry, in working with pro-life work, is we, being Catholic, we have our beautiful sacraments. We have our great liturgies. And of course, what's so beautiful, we have the Holy Mass. So supporting holy hours. And one thing we would do is I would gather, the leaders, and we talk, and we would spend time in prayer together, and we do it periodically. Again, the Lord doesn't build the house in vain, to the builder's labor, and that's very, very important, because again, it's not my work. And just like serving Human Life International, this is not my ministry. This is our Lord's ministry, and it's his work. And I just am joyfully privileged to be able to serve it and to give of myself to it. And that needs to be a constant reminder. And what I would say in closing this little segment, sharing with you, is having stood
and still stand at times outside of abortion facilities in prayer vigil and intercession and in counsel. You have to, if you're not grounded, and there are many times, you're thinking inside of you, especially when you're being confronted, not by the women coming. Sometimes that can get very emotional, but a lot of times it's the pro-advocates for abortion that are out there. And they're the ones that get in your face. They're the ones that really, try to provoke you. And, you have to really be able to be calm, to be relaxed, to be gathered in your thought. And I have to be honest, sometimes, I've never reacted to date. I hope I've never crossed that line. But I have to tell you, sometimes I'll walk away in those moments and I feel very upset, and angry at that individual. But then when I go back to prayer, I'm reminded, that I'm called to love that person, to care about them. And that's why I'm out there. And that's why all these people are out there. But I learned that in prayer. I learned that by going back to the one who loved me first and remembering that's what I'm called to do. And so that's why this beautiful advocacy is really a circle. It's a complete circle. It's not broken. It starts with love and it ends with love. Love of advocacy is intervention, and it's recognizing that God so loved the world, he intervened. So that's what makes me intervene. That's what this advocacy is about. And so I think it's a great moment, for all of us, who are listening, and I'm hoping that some people will walk away from our time together, Tad, in this podcast and say, okay, let me bring this to prayer and really give themselves to something before them. I mean, I've met people like that just because a priest preached on a homily and people were caught. And I've heard people, who meet someone over a cup of coffee and they say, what do you do every Saturday? I see you drive out of your yard every Saturday morning at 7 o'clock in the morning. Where do you go? You don't work on Saturday, right, Bob? Oh, no, I pray at the Planned Parenthood abortion facility, a couple of blocks from here. What? There's so many ways that people are introduced to this. And I hope that this podcast will do that. I hope it will touch hearts. And the story, I hope people will go back and look at it. I am grateful that it was unmasked. I'm disappointed that obviously that we have these kinds of stories. It's very painful, but I'm grateful that it's been exposed. And we have to work as advocates not to let it be buried. We have to make sure that this story doesn't disappear. And we know this with other abortionists that we've confronted over the decades who have done not only the heinous crime of abortion, but who have done other things, to hide what they're doing that are, from a legal point of view, that are illegal. And we need to keep bringing it up. We need to keep it out there. We need to show that this is wrong across the board from the get-go. Abortion is wrong. It's immoral. It's destructive. It's violent. A life is lost every time. That needs to be never forgotten. And that we need to do more to help women to realize this is not the answer. And that's a call. It's so we are the light of the world. So let's let that light shine. Let it shine brightly. Let it shine brilliantly for all to see. And I'm praying for everyone that's involved in this story, and I'm praying specifically for the ladies that are involved. They're going to suffer greatly. And we know this from, David DeLayden and many others. When they step up and you put yourself out there, you're going to face the enemy head on. And the devil doesn't back off, and he's continuing to push. That's why this is a spiritual battle too. So that's why I love about our podcast, Tad. We try to talk about both sides. We keep it, recognizing we have real things, reality issues, but we also have the real issue that it's a spiritual battle too. Mm.
And and exactly, Father, with this issue, it's just like we said. There's a prayer and action. I mean, that's really the Catholic life is a combination of that. And like I like to go back to Fulton Sheen, and he would preach often about if the church becomes too much of a church of just prayer, as maybe was the tendency in previous generations, but ignoring the men on the street or whatever the issue of the day is. That's not good. That's not Christian. Neither is it Christian to go full bore, only action, forget about praying, forget about being solemn, forget about worship. We just gotta, go, get in over our heads basically and kind of do the action, right? It's both and.
Exactly. Dr. Brian Close, one of our staff, and who's a great pro-life advocate, for decades, and we often say this when we talk about activism, especially in the mission field. It's part of our training and teaching. God first, family second, pro-life third. So God first, family, pro-life. When you get out of that order, something happens. And now people may take that the wrong way because we don't have enough time to explain all that. Right. But just think about it for a moment. God is God, and God deserves the worship and the praise. He deserves all of me, 100% of me. And if I'm a married man, married woman, my family, is my vocation. And then obviously from that vocation is what we're talking about. I'm called to give of myself totally to the great work of God. And so that can be in pro-life advocacy. It can be in many family advocate programs. It can be in many ways of working with the poor and the indigent. It can be many ways of serving humanity. Back to John Paul II's Evangelium Vitae, so serving human life. But if that becomes so focused in my life, it becomes the primary, and my family suffers, and then my relation with God suffers, something's wrong. And eventually what happens is that pro-life work becomes something wrong too. It leads to some not so good decisions. So it's not, it's a balance. It's really the balance. God first. Love of God with all of my heart, mind, and soul. All of me. Love God. Give God what is rightfully His, which is myself, in whose image and likeness I have been made. If my vocation is to the married life, then my love for my wife, my husband, my children, my family, my primary vocation, my fundamental vocation in the sense of what God has called me to live in a state of life and to serve Him in this capacity. That. I've met people, who are very active in our great cause, but I know there are some families that have struggled because their focus is so much. And that's great. I don't want to diminish that at all. But at the same time, there's this responsibility and duty. It's a balance. It's a balance. And when anything gets out of balance, they all suffer. So it's kind of thinking of a 3-leg table. Pull one leg, the other two might do a pretty good job for a while, try, but eventually that table is going to come down. And so that's what Dr. Brown and I talk about all the time. And it's not to overemphasize. It's just to say there's the balance. So unless the Lord builds this house, it's in labor. It's all for naught.
Or it's in vain. In vain do the laborers work.
Right. So it's just the idea that to think about that, to really, and I think that's a beautiful prayer. Ponder that scripture passage, and so just and let that be the guide. And if the Lord is building this house, if the Lord is the one that fills the cup, then everything it falls into place, right? But it will not fall in place if it's the flip. Mm-hmm. And so that's the danger. So I think that's a great way for us, I think that's great for the work that we're doing. And I try, and it's a good way to remind myself today as we're talking, I often, 99.9% of the time in my columns, always end with a call to prayer. And I try to remind myself that this is God's work, and we have to pray, and we have to ask. And our Lord says, ask and it shall be given. So we keep asking. And He says, seeking you'll find. We keep seeking, and we keep knocking. And so, I think I've shared this before, and I'll end, with that. It's an image that I love to pray with. It's my personal little image that I think about every day. And I am not raising myself to any position of glory here, all right, by any means. This is my prayer and my way of thinking is, I often in my nightly prayer, I think of armor. We've talked about this before in our podcast, and the idea is to put on the armor of Christ, and so St. Paul mentions and tells us. And I often think that every night when I finish my nightly compline, I take off my armor, and I get out my little hammer, and I knock all the dents out of it. I get my extra piece of metal and fill in the holes, all the things that need to be repaired, and then hang it on a hook. And the first thing in the morning is, got to put it back on and go right back out, knowing that it's going to get dented again, it's going to get chinked in many ways, and here we are. And that night, come back home again, knock out the dents, and what knocks out the dents is knowing that this is the work of the Lord. He's the one this is all for. So it helps me to remember, that alone I can do nothing, but with Him all things become possible. And that's how I know this kind of story we have conquered, and we will conquer.
because we're going to conquer hearts. And that's what frightens the other side so badly. So much, I should say, is because they've already lost. Inevitably, they've lost. But because the law and because where we are, we still got to get out there, and we still have to win hearts and minds. And so the first heart that has to be won is mine. And so I think that's just a wonderful way to keep it in mind. It keeps me humble too, I hope.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Father, for your reflections today. And hopefully we've given some people pause, maybe given people a chance to think, okay, what can I be doing? How can I take this a step further? Prayer and action, and thank you very much, Father. Okay, and thank you all for tuning in. Tuning in. Please, if you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe. Turn on notifications. If you're listening to us on Apple or Spotify or Amazon, please subscribe and follow us. And otherwise, keep on living the culture of life. We'll see you next week. God bless.